Good afternoon, students. Today is Monday, 6 September 2021. We're still waiting for word from the provost about how the semester will be completed. We're kind of in a holding pattern right now where I'm posting videos. I have heard a rumor that the provost will be sending people back into the classroom at full density very soon. In fact, as early as next week, but it's only a rumor at this point. I expect to hear something today or tomorrow so that we can plan the rest of our semester. So keep your ears peeled, and as soon as I hear something, I'll communicate with you by email, and we'll figure out what we're going to do from now on. But in the meantime, we have to keep going. So I'm preparing a videotaped lecture for you right now on the essay by Walter Stace, and it will be posted today. It's for tomorrow's class. Please do not go to class tomorrow, the 7th of September. The earliest we'll be going into the classroom will be Thursday, but I'm not saying that we will be going back Thursday. Maybe we'll go back a week from tomorrow. So just wait until we hear from the provost, and then I'll communicate with you by email, letting you know what we'll be doing. But in the meantime, let's get back to it. Now, our exam is coming up fairly quickly. 3 weeks from tomorrow, which is the 28th of September, will be the date we pause and take our first exam. The exam will be given on Canvas, and I don't really need to say much more about it right now. I'll tell you more about it as the time draws closer. You may have noticed that there are a lot of things posted on Canvas. Don't be daunted by it. Many of them are optional reading. What I mean by that is it's optional for you. You're welcome to read them if you want, but you don't have to. And that means I will not be asking you exam questions about any of these optional items. So if you go back just to the beginning of Stace, I posted Stace's article, which is like this. This is my copy of it. Okay, that's been posted for some time now. I also posted as optional reading a short biography of Stace. I then posted my lecture notes on this article by Stace, and I'll be going over them today, so you can follow along if you would like. I posted an Encyclopedia Britannica entry on teleology for you to read. That's optional reading, but it's pretty short, and I think it will do you good to read it. So I recommend that you take a few minutes to read it. I posted a lecture by Michael Crichton. Michael Crichton was a novelist, but he had scientific training, and he wrote an article. Actually, he gave a lecture in which he claimed that environmentalism is a new religion. It's very provocative and very interesting, so I hope you find some time to read it. In a related vein, I posted an article much shorter by a man named Jaffe entitled The Religion of Climatism. So I posted 2 items suggesting that maybe some new religions are coming into existence. I then posted, as an example of the rigorousness of philosophy, I posted a recent publication of mine entitled Dissecting Cohen. So skim it, flip through it, and you can see that philosophy is very rigorous, very precise in terms of how it views arguments and criticisms of arguments. As I said the other day, philosophy is not sitting around bullshitting. It's the opposite of that. It's very rigorous, very precise, very demanding. Okay, I also have posted items for the next reading. First of all, I posted the essay by John Mackey, J.L. Mackey, entitled Evil and Omnipotence. It's quite dated now, but it's still one of the most famous essays ever written on the problem of evil. And we're going to begin our discussion of the problem of evil by discussing that essay. That's posted. I also posted a short biography of Mackey. That's optional reading. And finally, I just this morning posted my lecture notes on Mackey's essay. So you should print them, and when I come to lecture on Mackey, you can follow along with my lecture notes. So let's get started. You'll notice from the reading list that today, the 7th of, or actually tomorrow, today's lecture is for tomorrow's class. And tomorrow we're supposed to be starting the essay by, tomorrow we're supposed to be finishing this essay by Walter Stace. And that means that later this week, we will take up a new topic, the problem of evil. And by the time you watch my video or come to the classroom, depending on what happens, you should have read the essay by Mackey. Okay, so I think I'm up to date on the odds and ends. Let's get back to the lecture notes. I'm on page 5. The lecture notes go on for 8 pages, actually 10 pages. So we're roughly halfway through. I think we have enough time to get through the rest of it. My notebook's falling down and moving my computer. Now, let's get back to a point that Stace was making when we stopped. Stace says that the decline of religion, which he says derives from the decline of teleology, has had some unfortunate effects. One of them is that people have stopped believing that morality is objective. They have come to believe that morality, or right and wrong, are subjective, that they're a matter of opinion rather than a matter of objective fact. The idea is that right and wrong are invented rather than discovered. And sometimes it's put in this way. The idea is that right and wrong are relative. They are relative to societies, for example, or to countries at particular times. So here in my lecture notes on page 5, here is my reconstruction of what I call the subjectivist argument. So let's follow along. This will be the first argument we've looked at. You can see how it goes. The first proposition is a premise. It asserts that there are objective moral values only if God exists. Many people believe that. Many people believe that in order for morality to be objective, which means a part of the world that exists independently of us, human beings, God must exist. So the first premise of the subjectivist argument simply says there are objective moral values only if God exists. The second premise asserts that God does not exist. And many people have come to doubt the existence of God. And according to Stace, that's because of science. Right? The teleology that underlies modern science has caused people to doubt the existence of God. Now, what do you get when you put those two premises together? The first premise, in effect, says that objectivity requires God. The second premise says there's no God. The conclusion, therefore, is that there are no objective moral values. Objectivity, with regard to right and wrong, is an illusion. There are no objective moral values. And the argument continues from there. That's just the first conclusion. Look at Proposition 4, which is a new premise. Proposition 4 says that if there are no objective moral values, then morality is subjective. And by that it means it's a matter of individual opinion rather than objective fact. So put 3 together with 4, and you get the grand conclusion of this argument. Morality is subjective. It's a matter of individual opinion. So I call that the subjectivist argument. It's an argument that proceeds from the denial of the existence of God and a claim about the connection between objective moral values and the existence of God. And the grand conclusion is that morality is subjective. It's purely a matter of subjective opinion. Your opinion about right and wrong is as good as mine. Each of us has an opinion about which acts are right and which acts are wrong. Right? So according to Stace, the decline of science has led to the decline of religion, and that in turn has led to subjectivism in ethics, and also to relativism in ethics. Now, some philosophers historically have tried to replace God in this picture with something else. And I mentioned just a couple of examples on page 6. Immanuel Kant, the Prussian, sometimes called German philosopher, Immanuel Kant believed that morality was a matter of reason, and that reason can give us objectivity without there being a God. Now, Kant himself may well have believed in God, but he knew that not everyone did. And so he believed that morality can be placed on a foundation of reason, and that God is not necessary for that. And Kant called his theory the categorical imperative. So for Kant, morality can be objective even if it turns out that there's no God. At least that's what Kant argued. Another great philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, who was an atheist, Bentham believed that morality could be objective even if there's no God. He agreed with Kant about that. For Bentham, what makes morality objective is what he called the principle of utility, the idea that all of us have the capacity to feel pleasure and pain. For Bentham, what makes an act right as opposed to wrong is that it produces the greatest balance of pleasure over pain. And that's an objective fact about the world. How much pleasure and pain your action produces is an objective fact. It's not a matter of anybody's opinion. So both Kant and Bentham, two very great philosophers, understood that as belief in God declines, morality may need a new objective foundation. Kant tried to replace God with reason. Bentham tried to replace God with what he called generalized benevolence, or the desire to produce the greatest balance of happiness over unhappiness. So I just mentioned those two great philosophers because both of them tried to solve the problem of subjectivity. They wanted to show that morality could be objective even if it turns out that there's no God. Now, what does Stace think about this? Is this attempt likely to succeed? Is there any hope for it? Or is it doomed? Here's what he says on page 55. Stace writes, and you can read along in my notes, "The question is whether it can ever be a practical success. That is, whether, apart from its logical validity and its influence with intellectuals, it can ever replace among the masses of men the lost religious foundation." Unquote. So what is Stace saying? It seems to me Stace is making a distinction between intelligent, educated people on the one hand, and people who are either uneducated or unintelligent. And what Stace is saying is that for the intelligent and educated people, morality can be put on an objective footing even if there's no God. For the rest of the people, however, that's not likely to be successful. Ordinary people, ordinary uneducated or unintelligent people will be persuaded by the subjectivist argument. They will conclude that if there's not a God, then anything goes. Right? If God is dead, so to speak, then anything goes. You may as well do whatever you please if God is dead, because God is the source of morality, and God is the source of right and wrong, these people believe. So if there's no God, if God is dead, then anything goes. So Stace is not optimistic that this attempt to put a solid foundation under morality is going to succeed. It may succeed for people like Kant and Bentham, but probably it won't succeed for the vast majority of people. who are either uneducated or comparatively unintelligent. I should point out, as I say in my lecture notes, that many philosophers today do not believe in God. They're either atheists or agnostics, and yet they believe that morality is a matter of objective fact. And I mentioned some names here. The names may not mean anything to you, but just to show you that I'm not making this up, there are philosophers named David Brink, Russ Schaefer-Landau, who went to graduate school with me many years ago, Derek Parfit, who died recently, and a famous philosopher named Peter Singer. Now, I put in my notes, apparently, because Singer appears to have had a change of mind in recent years. He says that Derek Parfit persuaded him that morality has an objective basis. And Singer is not a believer in God. So if Singer believes that morality has an objective basis, it must come from some place other than God. So there are philosophers, just to repeat my point, who believe that morality is an objective matter, even if or even though there's no God. The problem, as Stace points out, is trying to explain that to ordinary people. Imagine talking to someone who says to you, if there's no God, then anything goes, morally speaking. How would you go about persuading that person that even if it turns out that there's no God, morality is still objective? It would take a long and complicated explanation, perhaps an argument, to get that point across. And who has time for that? Most philosophers don't have time to go around trying to persuade ordinary people. The explanation is going to be long and detailed. The argument is going to have to be simplified so that people can understand it. So philosophers end up arguing to each other rather than to the people who need to be persuaded. Okay, so that's the first problem. As science and teleology have increased, As science has grown and developed, religion and the teleological basis for religion have declined. And one of the bad consequences of that, according to Stace, is that people have come to view morality as a subjective matter, as purely a matter of individual opinion. And that's a real problem, according to Stace. He wishes that there were something we could do about it. The second problem that Stace raises, that's caused by the decline of religion, is people have come to doubt the existence of free will. At one time, almost everyone believed that human beings have free will, that what we do is up to us, that at any given moment we are free to either do or not do a particular action. It's a matter of will, and our will is free. Many people have come to doubt that there is free will. Many people have come to believe that free will is an illusion. It appears that our actions are free, but in reality, they're not. So let's take a look at this argument. Let's take a look at how people have come to believe that free will is an illusion rather than a reality. Let's begin by quoting Stace. This is from pages 55 and 56 of his essay. Stace says this: science has been built up on the basis of determinism. Well, maybe you've never heard that word before. What is that? He goes on to tell us. Determinism, which is the belief that every event is completely determined by a chain of causes and is therefore theoretically predictable beforehand. So determinism, notice the word determine is in that word. Determinism is the view that every event, including human actions, including things you do, things that I do, every event, including human actions, is completely determined by a chain of causes. And if that were the case, then at least in theory, every human action, as well as every other event, can be predicted beforehand. If we had an exhaustive description of the world, if we had a list of all of the laws of nature that govern what happens in the world, we could predict everything that happens forever, right? We might need a supercomputer to do the calculations and to record everything, but in theory, everything would be predictable. Everything is caused, everything is determined by what comes before it, together with the laws that affect how things operate and how events occur. Now, here is an interesting argument that could be constructed based upon that. I'm going to give you the short version first. It goes like this. If determinism is true, in other words, if that's the correct picture of the world, and if determinism is incompatible with freedom, then human actions are not free. And it gets worse. If human actions are not free, if they only appear to be, but if they're not really free, then humans are not morally responsible for their actions. If my behavior is determined by antecedent events, then arguably I'm not responsible for what I do. After all, I didn't do it. I'm just the conduit through which these things occurred. The antecedent events working through me led to certain actions and to certain consequences. Where is responsibility in that picture? Right? You can't say that the human being who performed the action is responsible for it because he or she did what was caused to occur. What happened was causally determined. It wasn't a matter of will. So you can see, once we go down this road of determinism, someone might conclude that we end up with no responsibility. Human beings are just robots or automatons. Right? We are just programmed like robots. Notice my little robot act here. We're robots. We might think we're free, but that's an illusion. In reality, everything we do was determined to occur by events that preceded our actions. Now, Stace thinks this is a terrible argument. Stace and many other philosophers. He says on page 56 that this argument is, quote, a tissue of fallacies. He doesn't tell us exactly what they are, but he thinks that it's a fallacious argument. He says, unfortunately, quote, the analysis required to show this is much too subtle to be understood by the average, entirely unphilosophical man. In other words, people think that determinism undermines moral responsibility. Stace says it doesn't, it really doesn't, but if people think it does, then they're going to act on that understanding. And people are going to do whatever they please without thinking about the moral repercussions of it. People will take the attitude that whatever I'm going to do, I'm going to do. So I'm going to stop thinking about what I should do or what I shouldn't do. Right? So morality tends to dissolve or crumble in the face of this deterministic worldview. And by the way, where did this deterministic worldview come from? It's part of science. Science, modern science, says that everything in the world is determined to occur, including human actions. So modern science is deterministic. And many people draw the conclusion from that we have no free will, and therefore we are not responsible for anything we do. Stace once again says that is fallacious reasoning. So let me try to reconstruct the reasoning, and I'll show you what what part of the reasoning Stace disagrees with. It's at the bottom of page 6. Imagine someone unsophisticated making the following argument or reasoning in the following way. Premise number 1, determinism is true. Science tells us that. Premise 2, if determinism is true, then there's no free will. On the face of it, that seems true. If all of our actions are determined by antecedent events and the laws of nature, then it would seem there's no room in the world for free will, for free choice. What follows from these two premises? 3 follows. There's no free will. So if you accept 1 and 2, you're committed to accepting 3, which means you're committed to denying the existence of free will. You can admit that free will is an illusion. You can admit that we believe we have free will, but 3 says, in fact, there is no free will. Now let's keep going with this. The next premise, 4, says if there's no free will, then nobody is responsible for his or her behavior. When you put 3 and 4 together, you get the grand conclusion, which is at the top of page 7. Nobody, not you, not me, nobody is responsible for his or her behavior. And that's a frightening conclusion. Many people, including Stace, are truly frightened by that. The idea that nobody's responsible for anything he or she does or doesn't do. It's a world devoid of responsibility. Responsibility is what holds everything together. You are a responsible moral agent, we like to think. Right? You are responsible for what you do. If you do something that harms others, you may be punished for it by the law. You may be punished informally by your peers. They may choose not to do business with you or not to associate with you. You may lose your friends. Even your family may break off relations with you because of what you have done. That's one way we hold people responsible. We say, it was up to you whether to perform that action. You chose to do it. You knowingly harmed others. You are therefore responsible for that harm, and I'm going to punish you for it, either formally in the law or informally. So what I'm saying to you is responsibility is the glue that holds societies together. And many people have come to doubt the existence of responsibility because they have come to doubt the existence of free will. And what led them to that? The belief that determinism is true and the belief that determinism is incompatible with free will. So what does Stace say about this? Stace says that the problem with this reasoning is the second premise. The second premise, go back to page 6, The second premise says, if determinism is true, then there's no free will. Stace says that's false. Many philosophers say that is false. Determinism is compatible with free will. It's not incompatible with free will, which is what premise 2 says. Rather, it's compatible with free will. That position, by the way, is called compatibilism. Stace is a compatibilist. Many of the greatest philosophers have been compatibilists. So compatibilism says it's a mistake to infer from the fact that determinism is true that there's no free will. It can be true that determinism exists and also that free will exists. Free will is compatible with determinism. Now here's what Stace says on page 56. I do wish to draw attention to the weakening of moral controls, the greater or less repudiation of personal responsibility, which, in the popular thinking of the day, result from these tendencies of thought. So Stace is well aware that the effects of this argument are starting to show up. People who do bad things often blame others for it. We blame our parents. We say, well, I was raised in a certain way. Don't hold me responsible for my conduct. My parents brought me into existence. They raised me. They inculcated certain values in me. They educated me. They affected me in many ways. So I simply acted out what my parents made of me. I mean, that's buck passing. People say, don't blame me. I'm not responsible. Other things are my parents, my society, the peers or people I hung out with, right? I ended up with gang values because I hung around with gang members. I absorbed the values of the gang, and that's what led me into a life of crime. Don't blame me. I'm not responsible, and maybe because I'm not responsible, I shouldn't be punished either. I may need treatment of some sort or therapy, but not punishment. Right? Punishing people who are not responsible for their behavior seems grossly unfair. In fact, it seems absurd. Right? We don't blame animals for what they do. We don't hold animals morally responsible for their conduct. If a limb falls off a tree and harms somebody, we don't blame the tree. We don't say, bad tree, all right, we're going to punish you for harming that person. Right? That's absurd. It's not just unfair. It's not unfair at all because trees can't be treated fairly or unfairly. It would be absurd, crazy, insane to hold a tree responsible for its conduct. Well, if human beings aren't responsible for their behavior, then it would be just as absurd to hold them responsible for their conduct. So Stace is saying that he has noticed signs of this. People tend to pass the buck. They blame society for their bad behavior, their parents, their peer group, their religion. All kinds of things get blamed. You may notice in my lecture notes I have the words Twinkie defense. There was a case many years ago, and you can look this up. There's a link to it, but you can look it up on Wikipedia and read about it. To make a long story short, many years ago, someone committed murder and claimed that he wasn't responsible. He had been eating too many Twinkies, and he was on a sugar high. And his actions, he says, were caused by that sugar high brought on by eating Twinkies. And that defense was offered in court to absolve him of responsibility for his conduct. Many people laugh at that, but an attorney made that argument with a straight face in court. And as I recall, it failed. The defense was a failure, but just the fact that it was made in court shows that some people take seriously this idea that we're not responsible for our conduct. Other things or people are responsible. Okay, let me take a breath. Let's move on to Stace's section 4. Now, remember, Stace doesn't give his sections titles, but he does number them. So I'm looking now at page 56. You can see over here in yellow, I have Stace's section 4. That's where I am in his essay. I entitled this section Remedies or Salvation. And the reason for that is explained by Stace. Here's what he says. What then is to be done? Where are we to look for salvation from the evils of our time? All the remedies I have seen suggested so far are, in my opinion, useless. Let us look at some of them. So Stace has diagnosed a problem. The problem is that many people are in a state of chaos and bewilderment. He has diagnosed the origin of that bewilderment. He says it stems from the growth of modern science and the corresponding death or decline of teleology. People have come to believe that there's no grand purpose in the cosmos. They've come to believe that the universe as a whole is a meaningless, pointless, purposeless place. Many people have become atheists. They've stopped believing in God, a lawgiver. That has led them to ethical subjectivism, the belief that right and wrong are a matter only of individual opinion. It has led to the view that nobody is really, truly morally responsible for his or her conduct. And all of these are bad consequences, Stace says. Remember, Stace said that the decline of religion and teleology is a bad thing. He agrees with the Catholic bishops and with Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher. Not everyone shares that view. Bertrand Russell thinks that the decline of faith, of religion, of teleology is a good thing on balance. But Stace disagrees with him. Stace says it's a bad thing. What can we do about it? Things are falling apart right now, Stace says. How can we stem the tide of chaos and bewilderment, loss of faith, loss of personal responsibility? Stace says there are three possible remedies: philosophical, religious, maybe scientific. Let's take a look at the three and see what he says. Let's begin with philosophical. On page 56, Stace writes the following: what philosophers can do is to show that neither the relativity of morals nor the denial of free will really follows from the grounds which have been supposed to support them. In other words, the two arguments that we looked at today are bad arguments. Both of them are invalid. Both of those arguments are fallacious. And a philosopher can show that. That's what philosophers are trained to do: spot fallacies. A philosopher can look at an argument and find out where the problem with it is, if there is a problem. Maybe it's not, maybe there's not a problem. Maybe it's a good argument. But if it's a bad argument, as these two arguments are, according to Stace, the philosopher can show exactly which premise is false or which inference is invalid. So where is the fallacy? The problem with this, according to Stace, is that there's disagreement among philosophers about things like compatibilism. Some philosophers believe that compatibilism is true. They believe that free will is compatible with determinism. Other philosophers disagree. Other philosophers, who are called incompatibilists, think that free will and determinism are incompatible. And so you find a divide. Some philosophers are over here on that question, others are over here. So how can we expect philosophers to ride in and save the day when they themselves don't agree on things like compatibilism? Okay, that's the first point. Or another disagreement is whether there can be objective moral values without God. Some say yes, some say no. So philosophy is not going to be the savior, right? For that reason alone. But also keep in mind that philosophers need to persuade not only each other, meaning other philosophers, but philosophers would have to persuade lay people, people who are comparatively uneducated, maybe less intelligent. And there are a lot of them. So philosophers really have a tough job. They have their work cut out for them. They have to explain to people why ethical subjectivism does not follow from atheism or the death of God. They have to explain why moral responsibility does not go away just because determinism is true. So it's unlikely, Stace says, that philosophy will provide a remedy for the ailment that we are currently suffering from. How about religious? Stace says maybe there will be or should be a return to faith, a return to God. Perhaps a new religion will emerge out of the ashes of the old ones and perform the same functions that the old religion performed. Maybe a new religion with a new teleological picture of the world will come into existence, and people will regain their faith, and they will stop turning to ethical subjectivism. They will stop believing in the absence of moral responsibility. So maybe religion will be the savior in the end. Maybe we're going through a period of doubt. Religion, the traditional religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, maybe they're declining, but other religions, or some variant of those old ones, will emerge and perform the functions of the old religions. Stace is not optimistic about this. He says, well, one religion can be replaced by another. That can happen. How can non-religion be replaced by religion? Stace says, once teleology dies, it's dead. It can't be revived. You can't bring the dead back to life. No, Stace is implying that teleology is not just dying, but it's already dead. Other things he says in this essay suggest that he doesn't really believe that. Teleology is dying. He clearly believes that, but he doesn't really believe that it's dead yet. And if it's not really dead yet, then it can be revived and reinvigorated. It's like a person who's been lost in the wilderness for several weeks is rescued. The person is emaciated, close to death, but not dead. That person can be treated and fed and provided warmth, shelter, clothing, water, and other nutrients. And that person can be revived and brought back to a state of health. Well, if teleology is not dead, then it could be revived and brought back to a state of health. Stace is still not optimistic about this. If you look near the top of my page 8, he says, modern men have lost, and women, of course, modern men and women have lost the vision basic to all religion of an ordered plan and purpose of the world. They have before their minds the picture of a purposeless universe, and such a world picture must be fatal to any religion at all, not merely to Christianity. So that suggests that Stace is very pessimistic that religion will come back, that religion will be revived and restored to a healthy condition. Okay? Stace is just not optimistic about that happening. Maybe a new religion will come into existence, environmentalism, statism, scientism, which is a kind of faith in science. Who knows? And if these new religions come into existence, will they have a teleological worldview? Will they give people a sense of purpose, divine, cosmic purpose and meaning and point, or not? So a lot of these questions are interesting and provocative, but we simply don't have the answers. Will a new religion come into existence, or will the old ones become revived? We don't know. Or it's too early to tell. Okay, one more possibility. Maybe science will be the savior. We've tried philosophy, we've tried religion. What about science? Someone might suggest that we should turn to science itself, or perhaps more generally to the scientific spirit, for our salvation. And there are people today who suggest that. People like Richard Dawkins, the Oxford biologist, who has written books with provocative titles like The God Delusion, and people like Sam Harris. Sam Harris is, as I recall, a neuroscientist of some sort, and he's written books in which he's argued that science can supply moral values. We don't need religion for that. Science is our savior, these people seem to be saying. Other philosophers earlier in the 20th century have said similar things. People like Bertrand Russell, John Dewey. They had tremendous faith in science. And they said if we simply commit ourselves to science, it will solve a great many of our problems. It will help us avoid war, disease, pestilence. It will supply us with an inspirational moral values. It will replace religion with all the harm that religion brings with it, and so on. So, people both past and present think that science can be, perhaps will be, our savior. Stace is pessimistic, as you might have guessed. He says on page 57, this is, quote, utterly naive, unquote. He says also on that page, it is not likely that science, which is basically the cause of our spiritual troubles, is likely also to produce the cure for them. Think about it. Stace has diagnosed the chaos of the modern world by saying that it's caused by science, the growth of science. Are we now, having experienced the decline of religion and the bewilderment that has led to, are we now to claim that science is going to save us? Science caused the problem. How can science solve the problem that it caused? Stace is pessimistic about that. That's not likely. And besides, he says, science can supply us with means to our ends. It cannot supply us with ends or goals. Scientists are really good at telling you how to achieve your goals. If your goal is to put a man or a woman on the moon, science can help you figure out a way to achieve that goal. It did, in fact. But science doesn't tell us whether to have that as a goal. Right? That goal comes from elsewhere. Right? I don't know where, but it didn't come from science. So it's a two-part process. We choose our goals or ends, and then we turn to science to help us achieve them. Science is really good at that, but it's not good at all at giving us our ends, our goals, our objectives. So Stace concludes this section with a note of pessimism. He says, we're in a terrible spot, and it's not likely that philosophy, religion, or science will get us out of the spot. None of them is going to be the remedy that we need, the remedy that we seek. None of them is going to be our savior. They're not going to save us. So what is Stace's solution? This is section 5, the final section. Religion, Stace points out early in this section, is the basis of our ideals and our moral ideas. Right? Stace would say that's one of the good things about religion. It has provided human beings with lofty ideals, such as equality and dignity. It has provided us with moral values and many other good things. Unfortunately, religion has been undermined by science. As Stace puts it, the moral superstructure is tottering. So all of these wonderful things have been built up on religion. As religion gets undermined by science, all of these wonderful things come tumbling to the ground. The superstructure, that part that's built up on religion, is tottering, swaying, ready to crumble, maybe already in the process of crumbling. Now, Stace makes an interesting point here on page 57. He says, of course we know that it is perfectly possible for individual men and women, very highly educated men and women, philosophers, scientists, intellectuals in general, to live moral lives without any religious convictions. But the question is whether a whole civilization, a whole family of peoples, composed almost entirely of men and women, composed almost entirely of relatively uneducated men and women, can do this. Sorry, I skipped a couple of lines in my notes. So what is Stace saying in that long quotation? He's saying, we know that individual men and women, and I put in my notes, for example, Thomas Hobbes, David Hume, two great, and you might add Jeremy Bentham, three great British philosophers who lived at different times, all were atheists, or at least agnostics. None of them believed in God, let's put it that way. All of them lived exemplary lives. Thomas Hobbes lived 90 years. He served the Cavendish family for many decades. He tutored the children of that family. That's how he made his living. He wrote books and other documents. He didn't harm anybody, so far as we know. He lived a blameless life for 90 years, and yet he never believed in God. Right? He didn't go out and commit crimes, right, because he didn't believe in God. He conducted himself in a noble way, in spite of his lack of religious faith. The same is true of David Hume. When Hume died, his friend, the economist Adam Smith, wrote a letter in which he described Hume as among the very best people he had ever known, morally speaking. He compared him to a saint, or maybe it was an angel. Right? David Hume lived a sterling life from a moral point of view, and yet he never believed in God either. Jeremy Bentham, harmless. He wrote voluminously, but that's about all he did. He was the great utilitarian reformer. He lived well into his 80s. He never believed in God. I've read biographies of him. And yet he didn't go around lying, cheating, stealing, ripping people off. None of those things. Right? He lived a blameless life, morally speaking. So what Stace seems to be saying is, we know from examples like this that people who are not religious are capable of living morally upstanding lives, morally respectable lives. The question is whether we can expect tens of thousands or millions of people who are not as highly educated, not as intelligent as Hume, Hobbes, and Bentham. Can we expect them to live morally blameless lives? After all, many of them don't have the resources that Hobbes, Hume, and Bentham had. Many of them are struggling to make ends meet. Many of them have to work hard every day to pay bills, to support a family. The temptation to steal or to commit other crimes would be pretty strong. And sometimes people succumb to temptation. They know they shouldn't, but out of necessity, perhaps they steal so that they can feed their families. So Stace is simply not optimistic that ordinary, everyday people, what I'll call lay people, are capable of living these morally upstanding lives. The temptations are simply too strong for them to go astray, to violate the law, to break the moral rules. The problem, therefore, is this. Until we reach a world where people are as educated and intelligent as Hobbes and Hume and Bentham, what are we going to do in the meantime? He says on page 57, and part of this is me and part of it is Stace, how are we to live through the period between now, when most people are uneducated, and the time at which, quote, the vast majority of men and women are as highly educated as the very few are now? Right? How are we going to bridge that temporal divide between where we are now, where lots of uneducated people are tempted to break the rules, the legal and moral rules, and that future time when we will have educated almost everyone and they will be able to restrain themselves the way Hobbes, Hume, and Bentham did. So in the meantime, Stace says we've got to face two facts. We've got to face the facts. He says there's a two-part solution. Number one, we've got to face the truth. We need complete honesty. This means accepting that, quote, there is in the universe outside man no spirituality, no regard for values, no friend in the sky, no help or comfort for man of any sort, unquote. So Stace is saying we've got to face the facts. These are the facts, right? We've got to stop putting our faith in a being who may well not even exist. We've got to learn to abide by moral values, even though these values don't come from God or a father figure, a lawgiver. Right? We've got to learn to invent our own moral rules for the sake of all of us and abide by them. Right? That's hard to do, but facing the facts is often very difficult, and this will be as well. The second thing we need to do is learn to live with the truth. According to Stace, quote, this means learning to live virtuously and happily, or at least contentedly, without illusions, unquote. Now, he points out that humans have lived by two types of illusion. There's the great illusion, which is that the universe is moral and good, that it follows a wise and noble plan, that it's gradually generating some supreme value, that goodness is bound to triumph in it. That's the grand illusion. Right? That's the religious illusion. There are also minor illusions, a whole host of them, on which human happiness nourishes itself. We can keep those illusions, Stace says. They're harmless. Okay? Some illusions are harmless. Others are harmful. The belief in a supreme being who will punish us in accordance with our desert or reward us in proportion to our desert, that's a harmful illusion, Stace thinks. And we need to get rid of that one. We've got to get rid of the grand illusion, keep the minor ones, no big deal. They're not harmful. So let me end, I have some discussion questions. Let me end by reading Stace's final two paragraphs. So here's the final page. It's page 58. And I'm going to read these two paragraphs because Stace puts it better than I could. So let's just let him speak for a moment, then we'll talk about what he says. To be genuinely civilized means to be able to walk straightly and to live honorably without the props and crutches of one or another of the childish dreams which have so far supported men. That such a life is likely to be ecstatically happy, I will not claim, but that it can be lived in quiet content, accepting resignedly what cannot be helped, not expecting the impossible, and thankful for small mercies, this I would maintain. That it will be difficult for men in general to learn this lesson, I do not deny. But that it will be impossible, I would not admit, since so many have learned it already. Now you get a feel for Stace's beautiful writing. You may not agree with what he's saying, but it is well said. And here's his final paragraph. This, I think, is what caused so many readers of The Atlantic to become outraged and to send letters to the editor and probably to Stace himself. Remember, I told you that Stace was stunned by the negative reaction to this essay. Well, put yourself in the position of a reader of The Atlantic. One day the magazine comes in your mailbox and you open it up and you happen to choose this essay to start. You read it, it's fairly short, and you come, now suppose you believe in God, you believe in a purposeful, meaningful world in which God is at the center, of which God is at the center, and you read this essay and you come to the following paragraph. Man has not yet grown up. He's not adult. Like a child, he cries for the moon and lives in a world of fantasies. And the race as a whole has perhaps reached the great crisis of its life. Can it grow up, a race, in the same sense as individual men grow up? Can man put away childish things and adolescent dreams? Can he grasp the real world as it actually is, stark and bleak, without its romantic or religious halo, and still retain his ideals, striving for great ends and noble achievements? If he can, all may yet be well. If he cannot, he will probably sink back into the savagery and brutality from which he came, taking a humble place once more among the lower animals. That's the final paragraph of Stace's article. Now, the article ends on a really, frankly, on a really insulting note. Let me ask you point blank. You read the whole essay. You've listened to my lecture. Has Stace at any point in this article argued that there's no God? Has he gone any way toward persuading readers that their belief in God is false? To my knowledge, he has not. I didn't see anything like that in this essay. So why is Stace all of a sudden assuming that there's not a God? Right? He's saying we need to give up the childish fantasies that there's a Father in the sky who will take care of us in the end, who will reward and punish us in accordance with our earthly desert or merit. Stace is insulting his readers by assuming something they may not agree with, that namely that there is no God. So here are some discussion questions that I came up with on pages 9 and 10 of my lecture notes. Just questions that came to mind as I read Stace. First of all, why was Stace stunned by the violent reaction to his essay? Isn't he insulting those who believe in God? Who likes being insulted? Stace has done nothing to establish that God doesn't exist, and yet he writes the following. So I'm going to quote several sentences from Stace. In each of these quotations, Stace is assuming, without arguing, that there's no God. Okay, number one. He says on page 57, those who wish to resurrect Christian dogmas are not consciously dishonest, but they have that kind of unconscious dishonesty which consists in lulling oneself with opiates and dreams. Those who talk of a new religion are merely hoping for a new opiate. Now, I put in my notes shades of Karl Marx. Karl Marx, who was an atheist, described religion as the opiate of the people. According to Marx, religion puts people to sleep like opium, like poppy seeds. Have you watched The Wizard of Oz? in one of the final scenes, or one of the later scenes, Dorothy and her companions are going across the field of poppies that are growing toward the Emerald City. Remember the yellow brick road, which they're following? And a couple of them fall asleep. Dorothy and, as I recall, the Cowardly Lion fall asleep. The Tin Man and the Scarecrow do not. Why? Well, Dorothy and the lion are living organisms, and they are presumably overwhelmed by the poppy seeds, the opium in the air, and they are put to sleep by it. The Tin Man is not a living organism. He's an artifact, and the Scarecrow is just a bunch of straw put together. So they stay awake. They're not put to sleep by the opium, by the poppies. So Karl Marx was criticizing religion. He was saying that religion tends to put people to sleep like an opiate does. And Marx didn't like that, because Marx wanted a revolution now. And according to Marx, religion teaches people to accept injustices, what Marx viewed as injustices, such as exploitation of the workers. So Marx looked at religion as it existed in his day, and he said, this religion is teaching people to put up with injustice. It's putting people to sleep. He wants people to wake up and rise up and revolt against their oppressors, the bourgeois class, the capitalist class. So Marx famously called religion the opiate of the people. And that seems to be what Stace is saying, right? He said that religion people who are religious consist in lulling themselves with opiates and dreams. Okay, it reminded me of Karl Marx. Okay, page 57, Stace says, mankind has managed to live only by means of lies, and the truth may very well destroy us. What lie? The lie that God exists? Where has Stace shown that that's a lie or a falsehood? At no point in this essay has he argued that. In fact, I don't recall in any of the writings by Stace that I've seen where he argues that there's no God. He's merely assuming it. And of course, people can assume whatever they want, but don't insult people who don't share your assumption. It's fine for Stace to assume or believe that there's no God, but many of his readers believe that there is a God, and he's done nothing to show them that their belief is false. And yet he calls these things lies. And earlier he mentioned dishonesty and dogmas. Third, Stace writes on page 58, to be genuinely civilized means to be able to walk straightly and to live honorably without the props and crutches of one or another of the childish dreams which have so far supported them. Wow, this is packed with insults. So people who believe in God aren't genuinely civilized. That's an insult. They need crutches. They're unable to walk on their own. They need something to prop them up. They need crutches to help them walk. That's insulting. And they have childish dreams. No adult wants to be called a child or to be said to be dreaming like a child. So again, Stace is insulting many of his readers. Finally, he says, man has not grown up. He is not adult. Like a child, he cries for the moon and lives in a world of fantasies. Again, insults. One insult after another. And this man was stunned at the negative reaction. He should not have been stunned. He should have expected the negative reaction that he got. Right? If you insult people, you should expect a negative reaction to it. If you don't believe me, go out in public today. Actually, don't do this. But imagine going out in public, standing in line at a Subway to buy a sandwich, and insulting the person standing in front of you. Imagine saying, you're dressed like a child. Or, I don't know, how else would you insult somebody? You might say, I saw your car is a piece of crap. The person is not going to take those insults kindly. As you can imagine, you might end up getting punched or worse. So, Stace is insulting his readers. Let's continue with my discussion questions. Stace, as you know, refers to, quote, man's loss of faith, his abandonment of God and religion. Now, you may have wondered this as we went along. Does it seem to you that people have lost their faith in your community, among your group of friends and family members and associates? Do you sense that faith is declining? For whom, if anyone, is faith declining? Because Stace seems to think that it's declining. To whom is he referring? Religion, in fact, I would submit to you, is alive and well in the 21st century. Some 7 decades after Stace published this article, Stace might well have predicted that by 2021, religion would be dead and gone. How wrong he would have been. Listen to this. This is from the Pew Research Center in 2017. I'm quoting. The religiously unaffiliated population is projected to shrink as a percentage of the global population, even though it will increase modestly in absolute number. In 2015, there were slightly fewer than 1.2 billion atheists, agnostics, and people who did not identify with a particular religion around the world. By 2060, which is still 4 decades off, the unaffiliated population is expected to reach 1.2 billion. Now, here's the part I put in boldface type. But as a share of all people in the world, religious nuns, people who check the box none for religion, are projected to decline from 16% of the total population in 2015 to 13% in 2060. Now, I put in brackets the following. Put differently, the percentage of religious people will increase from 84 to 87 between 2015 and 2060. That's a period of 45 years. According to Pew and the statisticians and demographers who work there, the percentage of people in the world who are religious will increase from 84 to 87. And Pew continues as follows. While the unaffiliated are expected to continue to increase as a share, the population to increase as a share, I think I've left out a word here. While the unaffiliated are expected to continue to increase as a share of the population, let me circle that, in much of Europe and North America, people with no religion will decline as a share of the population in Asia, where 75% of the world's religious nuns live. So these are the facts as of 4 years ago by a reputable demographic survey organization. And it looks like religion is thriving worldwide. It may not be thriving everywhere. In fact, this suggests that in Europe and North America, religion is declining, or at least not growing as fast as it is elsewhere in the world. But worldwide, taking into account all the continents, religion is doing very well, thank you. So where was Stace getting off? Where did he get off back in 1948, strongly implying that religion is dying fast and will be gone in a few decades? Nothing like that has happened. Stace says on page 55, quote, belief in the ultimate irrationality of everything is the quintessence of what is called the modern mind. I would ask, whose mind? Whose mind is he talking about? Who believes in the ultimate irrationality of everything? If you believe in God, you don't believe that. You don't believe that everything is irrational. If you believe in God, you're likely to believe that God created this world as an orderly place. God made it a rational world. And yes, it has problems. There is evil in the world, but there may be a purpose. There must be a purpose for that, whether we can figure it out or not. The world is a meaningful place. It has a point to it. It's a purposeful place. I'm sure many of you believe that. So when Stace says belief in the ultimate irrationality of everything is the quintessence of what's called the modern mind, whose mind is he talking about? Probably not yours. Not 80% of the people in the world don't believe that the world is in a rational place. Most people in the world today, the overwhelming majority, are not bewildered by things in the world. They don't believe the world is chaotic. They believe the world is fundamentally an orderly place with point, purpose, and meaning. Stace says on page 56, modern men have lost the vision, basic to all religion, of an ordered plan and purpose of the world, unquote. My question, which men and women is he talking about, right? The overwhelming majority of people in the world, according to Pew, believe that there is a God and that God is responsible. God has a plan for the world, a purpose, and so on. Finally, Stace says on page 57, if we could make the vast majority of men as highly educated as the very few are now, we might save the situation, unquote. To which I say, really? Didn't Stace start out this article pointing out that it's a bad thing that people have lost the faith? In the very first paragraph or two of this article, Stace says, I agree with the Catholic bishops and with Jean-Paul Sartre that it's a bad thing that religion is declining. And at the end of his essay, near the end of his essay, he's saying that if we could simply educate more people, we could save the situation. But wait a minute. If we educate more people, they're going to lose the faith and they're going to be bewildered and feel that the world is a chaotic place with all the problems that Stace has pointed out. Won't what Stace is suggesting here speed up the process by which people lose faith with all the bad things that entails? Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I have great respect for Stace as a thinker. I enjoy reading him. He's a great writer. I don't always agree with him, but I'm almost always interested in what he says. There's a puzzle in this essay. There are two Staces in this essay. The Stace of the beginning of the essay says, while I'm myself not religious, I believe religion is on balance a good thing, and it's therefore unfortunate that it's declining. By the end of the essay, he's insulting religious people. He's making predictions that religion will die out, and he's actually hoping aloud that people become more educated. Won't that speed up the process that he himself has told us is bad in its effects? Very strange. It's as though he wrote this essay at two different times. Maybe he wrote half of it, put it aside for a few years, came back to it and finished it and published it. And that might explain why the first half of the essay is I guess you could say optimistic, right? He's saying religion is a good thing and it's too bad that it's declining. By the end of the essay, he seems to be saying religion is a bad thing. And the sooner we educate people and get rid of religion, the better off we'll be. Now, As far as the exam is concerned, there will be just a few questions on Stace. There will be a couple of true-false questions and maybe as many as 6 or 8 multiple choice questions. And I've given you a lot to think about, and there's plenty of material for me to test, whether it's a true-false question or a multiple choice question. I will probe your understanding of things like teleology and determinism. So you've got the reading itself by Stace to study carefully. You've got my 2 lectures on Stace, in which I try to explain it to you. And you've got my lecture notes that I followed pretty closely. And from those 3 sources, I will create and draft some exam questions. So I went a little bit over. It's an hour and 20 minutes in, which is actually the amount of time we would have in the classroom. So let me stop here. My voice is almost shot, but I made it. When I see you again later this week, it could be in the classroom on Thursday, or it could be another video lecture, and I don't know which it will be. I'm waiting for word from the provost. As soon as I find out what's happening, I'll let you know. I'll send an email to all of you. But in the meantime, you should read the essay by J.L. Mackie entitled Evil and Omnipotence. Get started on that, and also print out my notes so you can follow along when I give my first lecture later this week. So have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your Labor Day weekend, and I'll see you later in the week.